And thanks to Sinn Féin for presenting the motion today for debate regarding childcare and the fees. The motion mentions that the cost of childcare fees per child ranges from €800 to €1,350 per month. When looking at the headline figure, it's easy to see why there is a problem here and the cost compared with the average income. There have been a number of problems which have affected the childcare sector in recent years. Back in 2019, it was a headline news that childcare providers were struggling to get insurance for 2020. It also emerged that those who did succeed in getting quotes were quoted almost double the previous year's premium. This, of course, was exacerbated by the fact that there were only 2 insurance companies in the market, and one of those had decided to leave. This left no competition in the market and left the remaining company as the only option. If they were unwilling to quote someone or quoted a vastly increased rate, then one of the outcomes was that some childcare providers would have to close. The other outcome is that fees were raised by the provider. This is all particularly relevant because it meant a double whammy for the parents. Less supply of childcare places meant the prices went up, and the increase in insurance costs also causes prices to go up. This presents 2 significant difficulties. One, why are only 2 insurance companies willing to quote in the market? Is there an issue with claims and the court system which has kept providers away? It remains to be seen if the new personal injury guidelines will help in that regard. And 2, the latest issue, which is the way in which the sector is being funded by government. Funding plans have been announced from September, and the Federation of Early Childhood Providers have been quite clear with the funding problems facing the sector under the new plan. The government funding model will reward large providers with excess funding and leave the small providers balancing on the edge between viability and unviability. The funding received by the large companies per child is way above what is received by the small providers. It reminds me of a speech made by Deputy Fitzmaurice on a different issue some months ago. He made the point that government policies and regulations are far too focused on the big monopolies and the big providers to the detriment of the small and medium providers who are all too often left on the hind foot or unable to satisfy onerous qualifying criteria. This funding issue is another example of where the big companies are getting the support and the small companies are facing ruin. The government may choose to hide behind a headline figure to show that more than ever is being invested in childcare. And that may very well be true, Minister, but it isn't necessarily about the amount of total funding. It is mainly about the breakdown of that funding. It seems to me that the government's funding plan that they want a small number of big operators and they are happy enough to let the small and medium providers leave the market. But we need those small providers in the local villages who are central parts of our communities and provide vital services to support families and allow parents to work. These small providers are being asked to cap their fees, but they're not being sufficiently remunerated for it in return and overwhelmed with paperwork to comply. In other words, government policy is causing huge problems for many of these 2,000 small and medium operators. Government policy can be changed and should be changed because it's obvious that there will be major problems from September onwards if this situation is allowed to develop without the problems being addressed. To quote from the Irish Examiner article published this morning, 80% of the childcare providers questioned said that despite the government introducing new sick pay legislation this week, they would be unable to meet any demand for sick pay, while at the same time providing the necessary relief staff to meet required rations of carers to children, ratios of carers to children. Just another example of where government regulations are imposing burden after burden on employers. Between paperwork, regulations and generally cumbersome systems, successive governments are destroying businesses and disincentivising entrepreneurship, the burden of which serves only to drive up the cost of living further, something of which this government seems prepared to do little about. Thank you.